A reading from the Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 12th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
As he taught, Jesus said, "Watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted with respect in marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely." Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came in and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. I invite you to be seated. I apologize, I'm feeling a little bit raw in throat this morning. I sat in that chilly breeze for 4.5 hours yesterday, and I'm feeling the effects this morning. I'm a little surprised. I felt fine last night, but so if I'm clearing my throat a lot, I apologize. But I have to say, as I sat with the scriptures this week, that Psalm 146, was not lost on me. If you go back to when Deb was proclaiming that for us, that verse 3, "Do not put your trust in princes, in human beings who cannot save." As I was sitting this week with the election happening and the debates that were going on and the arguments about who was going to win and what characteristics they brought to leadership and the $1 billion that was spent on the campaign. You know those little "I voted" stickers that people were coveting so richly this week? $30 million was spent on those by our government to make those and distribute them across the nation. $30 million for "I voted" stickers. It became kind of a social media frenzy this week, didn't it, as people were posting those? I was thinking about the election in light of this psalm. Do not put your trust in princes, in human beings who cannot save, but put your trust in the Lord God, who upholds the cause of the oppressed, who gives food to the hungry, who watches over the foreigner and sustains the fatherless and the widow. The God that we are called to put our trust in sounds nothing like the voices of the talking heads on our TVs and in our media, who argue about who is responsible for just such as these: the foreigner and the hungry and the oppressed and the widow and the orphan. Who's responsible for them? We are. We are. And we're called to put our trust in that God. And so we have this first reading from 1 Kings that I want to stay with this morning, this story about Elijah. And I just want to put a little context on it so we can perhaps consider the import of what is being presented to us today about trusting our faithful God, who is always with us. Elijah was a great prophet of the Jewish people around 750 BC. And he came into a divided kingdom of Israel, northern Israel and southern Judah. And the king who was on the throne of the northern kingdom, Ahab, had become a corrupt, unfaithful king. He married Jezebel, if you remember. And Jezebel was one of those foreign princesses. She was from the land of Tyre and Sidon and Zarephath. She came from a people who worshiped Baal, the fertility god, the god of agriculture and life, and his female counterpart, Asherah. And Ahab, out of his love for Jezebel, had brought Baal worship into Israel. He built altars and allowed temples to be resurrected to Asherah. And Elijah was given the wonderful prophetic opportunity to go to King Ahab and tell him about his sin, about his unfaithfulness to God, and the fact that Yahweh God was going to withhold moisture from the land until his heart was turned, until his heart was changed. Elijah would show, Yahweh would show who the true God of life is. And so after delivering this very difficult message to Ahab and Jezebel, Elijah flees to the east across the Jordan River, where he hides out and listens to the Lord and prays and lives like a hermit next to a small river where the ravens supposedly came and fed him and nourished him. God took care of him through nature. But as you know, in droughts, over time, that small stream dried up. And the food source there dried up. And Elijah looked to God and he said, now what, God? The drought is at its height, and I'm suffering too. And God says to Elijah, I want you to go to Zarephath. And there, a widow will feed you. Imagine the shock of Elijah when he thinks that his God is sending him to the home of the bully queen to be fed by somebody who has nothing. His trust in God was challenged to its depths that day. To think that he was going to go to a foreign land to be cared for by the lowest of the low. See, widows, that term means the voiceless ones, had no power in community. In the culture, unless they had a husband or a son who could care for them, they depended on the community. They were the welfare state. And many in power and in wealth resented the widows. They looked for ways to dole them off onto other people. Or oftentimes we hear the sin of the nation is to neglect the widows and the orphans. And Elijah is being sent to just one such as this, to be cared for. But Elijah does what God invites him to do. He walks that journey, which would be like going from here to Manchester, walking up to the coast of the Mediterranean. See, there were no bridges or fences or walls to have to check through. He had to cross that invisible barrier at the end of Israel, entering into what is modern-day Lebanon, to move up to that country of Zarephath, of Tyre and Sidon. And he goes to this village. Now, typically, when a traveler approached a village, the men of the village would be sitting near the gate, and they would extend hospitality to travelers and visitors in the hopes that their honor would be elevated, that traveler would move on and speak goodness about their names in the next village. But what we hear in this situation is that Elijah approaches this village and there are no men there to greet him. The patriarch of the village, who decides how the goods are distributed to people, is not there to greet him. Instead, he finds at the village gate a lowly widow who is trying desperately to survive, to provide some source of life for her dependent son. She's there gathering up a few sticks from around the village wall so she can go back to her little hut and she can start a little fire and cook the final meal for her and her son. She sees scarcity. She lives in intense poverty and pain. And what does Elijah ask of her? Would you please bring me a morsel of bread along with some water in your own hand? Now that doesn't seem very significant, but if you think about the day, men, especially foreign men, especially Jewish men, did not interact with women, especially not out in daylight. Not an unaccompanied woman. That was considered culturally unacceptable. But his life depends on her. He is without food. He has no more water. He's been traveling. He depends on her. And he gives her a sign of dignity and respect that the culture did not allow him to do. He asks for her to bring it to him herself. He doesn't say, send the patriarch with some food. He doesn't say, send your son with some food. He asks her to bring the morsel of bread to him. And apologetically, she says, I don't have any bread to give you. It's not that she refuses him hospitality. Instead, she states what is true. I don't have anything to offer you. I'm going home to die. But Elijah says to her that wonderful phrase, don't be afraid. Which is so contrary for him because he's just been in the king's castle making him very afraid. Reminding him how big of a sinner he is. How he is jeopardizing the life of the community, of the nation. He has brought fear into the royal households. And here he is saying to the lowest of the low, don't be afraid. It's an angelic message. He says, go and do what you intend to do. But know that the God of Israel, our true God, the God of life and all providence, will provide for you if you simply share with me. If you can extend that hospitality to me, God will reward you with life. You will be reminded that there is enough where you see scarcity. And she trusts him. She goes home and bakes the cake and brings it to him, and he eats it and praises God. And because of her radical hospitality, because of her radical trust in the prophet of God, her household survives. Her household, we're not told how it happens. It's miraculous in that sense. But what we know is that their family survived. They had enough during the drought. And what we hear later on is that her faith grows even to more life because her son gets sick and dies. And Elijah is still with her, and she thinks it's because of her sin. She thinks it's because this holy man is in her house, and God has judged her unworthy of life, and her son has died. That means her future is gone. But Elijah has the opportunity to bring life back to her household by restoring breath to her son and returning him to her. There is life upon life because of her radical trust and hospitality. You know, as I sat with this story, it still happens. Maybe you've heard people talk after they've come back from mission trips or going into foreign lands to spend time with desperately poor people. It's true in my experience that they are, in fact, the most generous of the people in the world. Giving from what little they have for the sake of the relationship that they know, out of a deep love and care for the other. You know, this was affirmed for me when I was a freshman in college. I joined a group of other college students, and we went to Juarez, Mexico, across the border from El Paso, Texas. And Juarez is a large city of about 1 million people. Half of the city is a dump. Terrible, terrible poverty. The other half is a city similar to an American city, similar to El Paso, quite affluent, a large flow of money and goods, but the side that lives in poverty lives in absolute destitution. And gangs control the border between the two. Well, we were taking supplies from the United States into the dump site of Juarez, and we were there for about 10 days. The second day we were there, we were taking a van load of tortillas that had been donated from a bakery in El Paso. The whole back of the van was filled with packages of tortillas. And we went into the village that we had been the day before. And the people lined up to receive the food that we brought. And in the line was Maria. It's a very common name. But she had 2 little kids who would peek out from behind her flowing skirt. And I had met them the day before as we were passing out fruit. That day, I took out a package of tortillas. And I gave it to Maria. And she gratefully accepted it from me. Gracias, amigo. And she went back to her little hut that was right around the corner. And it was a little hut that was made up of 3 pieces of corrugated tin and a roof that was made out of thatch and cardboard. They slept on the floor in there. Right outside her door, she had a little makeshift campfire, if you will. And she had a few sticks she had managed to pick up that morning, and she had a little fire going. And she took that package of tortillas back to her hut. And she opened it, and I could see her just around the corner. I was watching her. She took a tortilla out, and she placed it on the little stone that was on top of the fire. And she took a pair of sticks, and she flipped the tortilla after it had bubbled up brown. And she had a little smile on her face. And she took the tortilla, and she walked back, and she gave it to me. She gave me the first tortilla. I felt so incredibly unworthy and so loved by her generosity that she cared for my heart without me asking. I didn't need anything, but she extended to me what I needed most. The relationship to know that I mattered, that I was somebody important in her life. Then she went back and fed her children, and then she fed herself. Radical hospitality, radical trust happens around us all the time. I don't know if you see it. I don't know if you can sense what Maria had that I desperately needed, what that widow in Zarephath gained from her radical hospitality with Elijah. She came to know the true God of love and life in a personal way. It created for me a way to know God more deeply. And so, this week I came upon a story that, again, I think in our modern day just lifts this idea of radical hospitality out to us to ponder today. And I would share with you these words of Ari Mahler. Ari was a Jewish nurse who was sent in to work on the shooter in the synagogue last week. And these are his words. I am the Jewish nurse. People have been talking about me all week, and it was time for me to speak for myself. Yes, that Jewish nurse, the same one that people are talking about in Pittsburgh's shooting that left 11 dead. The trauma nurse in the ER that cared for Robert Bowers, who yelled, "Death to all Jews," as he was wheeled into the hospital. The Jewish nurse who ran into a room to save his life. To be honest, I didn't see evil when I looked into Robert Bowers' eyes. I saw something else. I can't go into details of our interactions because of HIPAA, but I can tell you that as his nurse, or anyone's nurse, my care is given through kindness. My actions are measured with empathy And regardless of the person you may be when you're in my care, each breath you take is more beautiful than the last when you're lying on my stretcher. This was the same Robert Bowers that just committed mass homicide. The Robert Bowers who instilled panic in my heart, worrying my parents, were 2 of his 11 victims, less than an hour before his arrival. I'm sure he had no idea I was Jewish. Why thank a Jewish nurse when 15 minutes beforehand you'd shoot me in the head with no remorse? I didn't say a word to him about my religion. I chose not to say anything to him the entire time. I wanted him to feel compassion. I chose to show him empathy. I felt that the best way to honor his victims was for a Jew to prove him wrong. Besides, if he finds out I'm Jewish, does it really matter? The better question is, what does it mean to you? Love, that's why I did it. Love as an action is more powerful than words, and love in the face of evil gives others hope. It demonstrates humanity. It reaffirms why we're all here. The meaning of life is to give meaning to life. And love is the ultimate force that connects all living beings. I could care less what Robert Bowers thinks. But you, the person hearing this, love is the only message I wish to instill in you. If my actions mean anything, love means everything.